Welcome to the Neophytes of Narrotology, the internet's most pretentious and pseudo-intellectual pursuit since, perhaps, Nietzsche's thus podcast Zarathustra, or Camus' renowned Vlog of Sisyphus. While lesser men aspire to stand on the shoulders of mere giants, we at the Lost Signals will accept nothing less than titans. So join us as we delve into the fundamentals of narrative nuance and critique the critics who proclaim to know the universal qualities of effective storytelling.
Hi, and welcome back to Neophytes of Narrotology. Today we are starting our next big project, Joseph Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces. I'm Jonathan Ian Manser, here with Scott Thurlow.
And I am a villain of 1,000 faces.
And Stephen Ramosi.
It's too many faces.
So, I've never read The Hero of 1,000 Faces, but I've certainly heard it referenced many times in other podcasts and among reviewers. It's an incredibly influential work.
Yeah, it's pretty pervasive amongst study of narrative. Let's go on a hero's journey.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I've experienced Joseph Campbell before in The Power of Myth, which I really enjoyed, where he broke down a number of the symbolic aspects of different myths around the world. I think that came out in 1988. This work came out in 1949. None of you have read anything else by Joseph Campbell.
I have not read any of his works directly, no, but like you said, I've definitely been familiar with his influence.
I've been working on this book for 2 years, where I pick it up every once in a while and read a little bit, but I've only made it about halfway through.
Well, that's the beauty of this podcast. It forces us to read some of the works we've been intending to for a long time.
Sure.
I'm glad I'll be able to get through it, yeah.
So I just wanted to give a brief kind of explanation of how, when we did Roland Barthes' SZ, the thing is we're recording these episodes as we read the books. Mm-hmm. So we haven't finished this work. We've only finished the Monomyth, which is the prelude to this entire work so far, which we're reading it and assessing the work as it's going. So
not necessarily as a whole.
Yeah. So if he clarifies a point later on that it is he fails to expand upon when we're currently reading that, take it as we're developing our thoughts of this as we go along.
Mm-hmm, sure.
So I just want to make that clear. So without any further ado, unless any of you have any points.
No.
I started off with the preface of this work, and where he expands upon his intent, which is that all myths are symbolic, and he's assessing the common underlying themes while ignoring the differences. He feels the differences are less important than what binds them together. And he also brought up Freud. Now,
of course,
the thing that perhaps surprised me the most after starting the Neophytes of Narrotology is how often Freud
he is everywhere.
And it's so strange to me.
He's everywhere in narrative too, which is weird.
Well, this is narrative, but
you never. Well, that's what I'm saying.
To be clear,
you had you think of Freud as psychology, not really coming up in these types of things, but he is all over the place.
His
when it comes
ideas
to stories
seem to match. And before you go on, I just want to point out real quick thing. I think that's sort of maybe a sign of the times. Like you said, Here with 1,000 Faces was originally published in 1949. So I think Freud's influence was still bigger then, and maybe less so today. If this book had come out today, that might not have been the case, but nevertheless, it is there contained in this work.
Yeah, but I am kind of growing tired of
Freud. Yeah. Sure.
Because not everything's about castration. And he's sort of the antagonist of at least my hero's journey. Oh, I can't wait to read Joseph Campbell. Freud's behind
Freud's
everything.
back.
Yeah. Oh, all Oedipus.
Yeah. So I'm going to kind of, to make a point about why I'm actually kind of upset with Freud's appearance here, will be to go into, I think, in The Myth and the Dream, which is the first section of the Monomyth, where I believe Joseph Campbell is attempting to justify and provide a foundation for his work on psychoanalysis?
I mean, yes and no. He's certainly like, I don't know if I disagree with the use of the term justify, but certainly he brings it up in order to solidify perhaps his ideas.
It's the I'm not crazy argument. I'm not crazy because this guy did it.
Yeah, sure.
He's saying psychoanalysis does it with dreams. Everything that psychoanalysis applies to dreams can be applied
to myths
to
and myth-making.
mythology.
Sure.
Right. And I think he's also saying that these myths are born out of the same cycle that we have in our dreams and like in the beginning of our lives.
Yeah, they share a lot of crossover for sure, as he mentions that or raises it as a thing he's going to try to explore.
Yeah.
So I'm going to insert. Joseph Campbell, I see you're Austrian psychologist and raise you a German mathematician.
Oh boy.
Who is one of my favorite philosophers, Gottlob Frege, who, when discussing the attempts to base the foundations of number on psychology, he said you can't found anything upon a science that has such shaky footing as does psychology.
Sure.
And that is the thing is that, I think he's trying to, again, you disagree with me, Scott, but I think he's trying to build a foundation on psychoanalysis, but I think that's such a shaky foundation.
I don't think he's trying to build a foundation, but I do think he uses it as somewhat of like to build the pillars he is going to build. Yes, he certainly is acknowledging Freud's influence and Freud's work, specifically in the section titled Myth and Dream, because as Steve-O mentioned, a lot of the symbols and imagery and so forth that appear, they sort of like share the myth space and the human's dream space, psychologically, which I get, but I don't think it's like one of the major things, but he certainly spends a little bit of time going over it.
I don't know. I think I'm going to agree with Ian on this one. I think that he is going to base a lot of this. Well, I've read a little bit more than you guys, so I can tell you that a lot of this stuff is based on kind of the. There's a passage in here that I was just looking for. This kind of sums up what I was thinking about when you guys were talking about this, but it says it has always been the prime function of mythology and right to supply the symbols that carry the human spirit forward in counteraction to those constant human fantasies that tend to tie it back. So,
sure.
So he's makes a fairly strong foundation here in the idea that like dream is kind of split into two things: the ideas that are going to like bring you back to your infancy, and then the ways forward out of those. And like that's what myths were
then utilizes,
and still are to some degree.
So this actually brings me up to a question I had that I wanted to posit to you two.
Mm-hmm.
So is psychoanalysis, when taken to the cultural ritual, is it the modern form of the cultural ritual, or was the cultural ritual a early form of psychoanalysis? Chicken or the egg?
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. And I, if you were going to bring that up, I was going to bring up something similar to it. To answer, I think it is kind of a chicken egg. Like, I see what you guys are saying. I don't want to dwell on Freud too much, but nevertheless, because it is contained herein this work,
he haunts us.
Yes, yes, you can't escape his specter. But I all I'm saying is, I think there is something to be found in like the root kernel of human psychology / dreams as applied to why myth exists and how we use them and how all cultures have ever used them. I don't think it's the be all end all, certainly not. And like I said, maybe if something like this work was written more removed from Freud's time, it would have been less of an influence. But I still think there's something to be said and to be found there. And I guess, Steve, as you said, he will use it more often perhaps than we might like. But I don't think it's completely moot, is what I'm saying.
I don't think that there's anything wrong with the way that he goes forward with it. I do like the very beginning here is very Freud heavy. Mm-hmm. He moves away from that.
Yeah,
going forward,
quickly,
if I recall correctly, what happens, in the first few sections of this book.
He starts. I just kind of want to catch up to where we are now. Starts off with the Indiana Jones type ending with like,
sure.
From the mountains of Timbuktu to the point, like this type of like he's exploring all these different types of myths as kind of like a almost travelogue style, like trying to get you excited to read the book. then he goes into the I think the explanation of what psychoanalysis is. Now, Scott, you were bringing up earlier that Freud's influence has slipped in society.
I would
today.
argue for that, yes.
And I think that what he's doing here is he's providing examples of psychoanalysis to his audience who might not know what Freud's whole deal is.
And I think that's fine. I just want to bring up one other quick thing and sort of relate it to Freud, a psychoanalyst / person within that profession that I kind of, if not respect more, I'm more gravitating towards ideas. He brings up Jung, of course, which I always like Jung's ideas. And I think the collective unconscious / subconscious thing also he brings up applies to myths.
Yes. In fact, I would say that probably has more of a influence than Freud.
Sure, I'm just saying it's there. They're both there, but I think, like I said, the only thing I can say is that I believe there is a kernel of truth to be found as applied, one to the other.
I just want to have one last point for like the true opening is he kind of compares psychologists to being the wise old men and sage of the old
or scientists too, but he does mention that like the figure in myth where a kindly old if not supernatural help, outside help comes and guides you along your way. Yes,
I wish Freud's archetype was used more in the that aspect. But so then he goes into Theseus and the Minotaur for quite a while.
Sure, just as sort of an example.
But what's interesting is he was kind of losing me at this point because I'm like, Freud. And then halfway through the discussion, he drops out of psychoanalysis completely and going into cultural analysis and like the symbology. And it was getting me right back into what like the Minotaur could have represented and different. Like, and then he goes, when he introduces Theseus, he goes right back to psychoanalysis.
Well, he switches back and forth.
Yeah.
Sure.
Right. He does switch easily back and forth between modes in this. Throughout the whole intro, he does the same type of thing, and it's I think it's really interesting to be able to work that way, to be able to write something that way too.
I think it's effective enough. I wouldn't say probably you said it was losing you. I don't think that was true of me, but I see what you mean about those sections.
So I'm going to read a couple quotes here, which is right after the Theseus part, where he's describing the role of the hero in these stories. So, in a word, the first work of the hero is to retreat from the world scene of secondary effects to those causal zones of the psyche where the difficulties really reside, and there to clarify the difficulties, eradicate them in his own case, i.e. give battle to the nursery demons in his local culture, and break through to the undistorted, direct experience and assimilation of what C.J. Jung, as you were mentioning, Scott, has called the archetypal images.
Exactly.
So that's not quite in a word. That is
sure. Fine. You take issue with his use of that phrase, but I get it.
And then the second, his second solemn task, indeed, therefore, is to return then to us, transfigured, and teach the lesson he has learned of life renewed.
Sure. Yep. And I remember reading those lines or those parts of the passage and thought they were pretty well phrased as well. And it gets to his point, like what he's trying to point out when he's going to use, like you said, using the Minotaur and the Theseus myth as examples to sort of exemplify those points.
And that the hero the role is to start where we are, transcend,
come to some sort of enlightenment and so forth,
and bring back an experience. I have a final quote for this section I want to read. Furthermore, we have not even to risk the adventure alone, for the heroes of all time have gone before us. The labyrinth is thoroughly known. We have only to follow the thread of the hero path, and where we had a thought to find an abomination, we shall find a god. Where we had thought to slay another, we shall slay ourselves. Where we had thought to travel outward, we shall come to the center of our own existence. Where we had thought to be alone, we shall be with all the world.
Sure. We find the center of our own maze, Westward style, if you will.
And he comes back to this a lot, where like a very important part of the hero's journey is the journey inward, as opposed to just the physical journey that they go on.
That's pretty much Myth and Dream, and we've discussed what we thought. I guess he used well, and your irksome feelings towards the introduction of Freud, but nevertheless,
he's always with us.
You can't escape him. So now we're on to tragedy and comedy, which was actually my favorite section of the opening.
It was short, but succinct and well done. I'll agree with that.
It starts with Anna Karenina and what draws us to tragedy.
That's obviously why you liked it, by the way.
Well, it's a great first quote.
Yes.
And I think that what's really neat is here, he's challenging our modern conception of what like. In our modern times, we find tragedy to be more important than comedy.
Exactly. And to that point, I picked out a quick passage, if I may read. He writes, "Modern literature is devoted, in great measure, to a courageous, open-eyed observation of the sickeningly broken figurations that abound before us, around us, and within." So it's more like, we realize the world is kind of fucked up, but nevertheless, we engage with it and report back our observations.
One of my favorite quotes, though, is, "Modern romance, like Greek tragedy, celebrates the mystery of dismemberment, which is life in time. The happy ending is justly scorned as a misrepresentation, for the world as we know it, as we have seen it, yields but one ending.
Death." Yes, of course. I know that's the answer, but...
Disintegration, dismemberment, and the crucifixion of our heart with the passing of the forms that we have loved.
I only did that because as I was reading that sentence, I'm like, I know what he's going to say at the end here. It's obvious, Campbell. But sure, it's a good quote.
Yeah, and it's this section, which is I think 5 pages long or whatever,
it's
approximately,
like 7,
is all about. A lot of it seems like it's about proving that comedy is more important or as important as tragedy. But I think an important thing that comes out of it, if you're when you're done reading it, is that these are almost inseparable things. And
exactly. That's
like comedy is tragedy is funny. Like there's a line that I guess this is my favorite one. It's just about the tragedy is the shattering of forms and of our attachment to the forms. Comedy, the wild and careless, inexhaustible joy of life, invincible. Thus, the two are the terms of a single mythological theme and experience which includes them both and which they are bound.
Sure, exactly. They're two sides of the same coin in which the coin is constantly spinning.
What needs to be really addressed is that this isn't tragedy and comedy as we take it
as
in
you
our
normally
days.
define them. Sure,
this is how Aristotle defined them in his Poetics. Watch our episode on that, which was our very first work. So it's nice to see our fruits have gone to something.
Getting some reference, sure.
Yeah.
So, but he's like comedy in the sense that like happy endings also.
Right.
How not just like what we laugh at. In fact, I think he kind of ties satire in more with tragedy than he does with generally.
A little bit. I got that sense as well.
And I don't have the section marked, but there's also a part where he talks about how what one person's tragedy is just a divine comedy, like God's, like how the gods in these myths look on people as just playthings, and it can be a tragedy to an individual person, but for a god, your death is funny to them, or it's like to a god, there's a little lightness in somebody's death or misfortune.
But it also kind of has that religious bent to it. That tragedy is catharsis in the sense of like the Greek use of it, which is a purification, and that we need to, in order for our tragedy to have meaning, it has to have that
aspect to it,
and also the uplift of what comes from comedy. With, in a sense, if you would look at it in a religious bent, like Jesus Christ went through suffering only to find the divinity after the crucifixion.
Right.
And in a sense that, you need to have, as you brought up the two sides of the coin, that comedy only really works. We start at infantile comedy. We go into the tragedy, which cuts us off from our worldly type things, and we go to the happy ending of whatever religious bent you have cultural bent. But section, and that the hero's journey is that cycle of like birth, death, and rebirth.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Any other thoughts?
No, it's like I said, a short section, and I think we covered it pretty well.
So the third section is the hero and the god.
I think this is my favorite section before you go on.
Which he outlines, in a sense, the hero's journey. Like, he's been kind of building
a very basic diagram of it, if you will.
So I'll just read off one thing. A hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered, and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man.
And that is every myth ever.
Yeah,
and we're back to the beginning. Yeah.
And this is him kind of beginning to write his formula, or establish his thesis that he's making here. He actually spends a lot of this section going over what he'll be writing for the next sections, which I don't think we should really dwell upon. Because
no, it's fine. Again, it's a very basic sort of outline of it, but which he will define more clearly as it goes on, as I understand.
And he uses Buddha, Christ, and Moses as examples of
exactly heroes of that match basically what you just read out.
So I really have nothing more to say about the section. Scott, you said it was your favorite. Do you have anything else?
I mean, yeah, because like you said, he does spend a couple of pages basically outlining the Buddha myth first of all, and then tying into the other figures you just said, and then actually also right at the end, towards the end, he lays out the parts of the. Since this is still technically the introduction, he lays out what he's going to actually cover in the heart and bulk of his work, which he has. He sort of cuts it up into little things like, for example, the hero's journey consists of little subsections: the call to adventure, refuser of the call, supernatural aid. Everything you just said in that one little sentence or two about the myth, he will cut up into
breaks down further.
Exactly. And I think at the very end, like I just have a note that it's almost like the cyclical nature of it, as you said, where the thing I found most interesting is that he arrives at a conclusion, and he's going to lay out further that the hero and the god are basically one and the same person. The god basically represents the spiritual aspect of man, of the hero, which he has to either find within himself or get some guidance to find to complete his journey. So I thought they're not like separate entities, as we said. Basically, they're almost like the tragedy and comedy. As we said, they're two sides of the same coin once you are able to sort of introspectively find oneself in such a way. So I thought that was interesting, and I'm sort of quite looking forward to how he's going to break that idea down further.
I don't remember if it's in this section or in the World Naval section, but there's a part where Campbell is talking about how these heroes are broken up and how there's like local heroes and the global
tribal
like tribal heroes and like global heroes, and you have like Jesus, who's a global hero, or Buddha.
I think Moses was a tribal hero.
Moses
whereas
was
Jesus
like
is beyond that.
A hero to his tribe or whatever. But I thought that was a really interesting little section.
Well, it's scope application. It's saying that the hero's journey does not just necessarily need to have a Prometheus or a
level of
Buddha.
Sure.
It can be a
local
person.
Right. And amongst all of these different types of heroes, they still have the same cyclical, you start in one place, you go off into some ethereal or like, otherworldly perhaps adventure, and then come back better for it and able to help your people in whatever way, whoever your people are.
Whatever kind of help that form may take. Sure. So actually I just found the passage I was saying. I'll let Campbell speak for me or condense it to close off. He writes, The hero and his ultimate god, the seeker and the found, are thus understood as the outside and the inside of a single, self-mirrored mystery, which is identical with the mystery of the manifest world. The great deed of the supreme hero is to come to the knowledge of this unity and then to make it known. So I thought that was quite well said, and I enjoyed that section of it at least.
I do want to mention one other thing for while we're in this section, which I thought was really cool, and I can't remember if he talks about this later on in the book or not, but where he mentions the circular adventure of the hero appears in negative form, and he gives the other, the other one.
That's a good call.
In stories of the deluge type, where it is not the hero who gets the power, but the power that rises against the hero and again subsides. Deluge stories occur in every quarter of the earth. They form an integral portion of the archetypal myth of the history of the world, and so belong properly to part 2 of the present. And
sure, but you're right. That's a good call. He does introduce sort of like you said. I like that description as he writes the negative of that myth.
Right.
And I'm looking forward to his more in-depth discussions as we go on. And actually, this is a good entryway into the final section, the World Naval, which I actually feel is his weakest section.
I would agree with that.
Where he is attempting to, in a sense, unite creation myths, which will be the second part of this book.
Right.
It's not just the hero with 1,000 faces, it's also the creation myths of 1,000
The
faces.
origin of the world with 1,000 origins, I don't know.
I don't know if it's a bad argument yet, because we haven't gotten to that section yet, but it so far isn't as convincing as his argument for the hero.
I think it's more like, sorry, Steve, just real quickly to respond to that, Ian. I think it's a bit more like flowery, poetic. So like it's not as grounded in like thesis style analysis, I would say. Even though I understood what he was getting at, but you're right. It's sort of more like unfocused, I guess I'll say.
I mean, I was just gonna, what's the argument that you are referring to? I mean, like part of what I gather from this section, and yeah, it does go off into like I feel a couple tangents at points, but
I think it's built of tangents, I guess is my issue.
Part of what I gather from the section, and what I really, what I think hit home for me was there's a section that says the world navel then is ubiquitous, and since it is the source of all existence, it yields the world's plenitude of both good and evil. And that's something.
Yes, but that's vague to me. So go on.
But that's something that is very obvious in myths, in every creation story, or most, I would say. You can always find other. So
there's deduction and induction, and in the first section of this, I feel that he is. I always get them confused. Induces when he takes examples and finding a theory from all these examples and building like commonalities. I feel here is a deduction where he's starting with a theory that he developed from all these heroes and trying to apply them to examples.
I think he's working backwards,
which is actually a weaker argument than. So he's not working backwards, but like he's top downing.
Reverse engineer. Sure, I get it.
Saying I'm trying to fit these different myths into a theory I developed, where before he's like, this is the theory I developed from these
the myths
stories.
Like sort of gave rise to that.
So
yeah, I get it.
I apologize if I switch them. I always forget, but like so it's a weaker form of argument. The world navel.
I get it. It's
and that's what I feel he's doing. I don't know if he will fix that later on. But.
Okay.
No, I mean like you said, I think you and I are closer in our impression of this section. And like I said, just the only, if not issue, as I was reading the world navel, like I understood what he's trying to get at, but it's like he talked around it a lot before saying anything of substance, or at least solid to me. And sure, I assume he's going to expound upon it later. Just that this one was the most, sort of wandering in his musings and his whatever, like his points that he's trying to come across.
Yeah. All right. Any final thoughts, guys?
No, I mean, I think I liked the Monomyth as an introduction, as a prologue, well enough. I think, like you said, at the very least, it certainly is clear about what he's going to lay forth as he delves deeper into it. And I'm very much interested in sort of stuff. And and as we also said, its influence is pretty big. So
I agree. I'm looking forward to going back over what I've previously read and then getting further into this than I actually made it before.
Perhaps remembering what you read 2 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. Sure. And it's going to be an interesting journey. I remember being very interested in a lot of the things that were going on, especially as he started detailing the hero's journey and stuff like that. So we've got that.
Thank you for joining us. Check in for new episodes of Neophytes and Narrotology, and to follow us on our own hero's journey with Joseph Campbell as the wise old sage, and Sigmund Freud, Uncle Siggy, as the trickster god, and our greatest adversary. And I am Jonathan Ian Manser, here with Stephen Amosi.
Have a good night.
And Scott Thurlow.
And we'll see you in the next path of the journey. Good night.
This has been the Neophytes of Narrotology. We hope that you've experienced an epiphany or two of the literary nature, but only metaphorically, of course.
Editing and engineering by Jonathan Ian Manser. Music by Christopher Morgan. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates.